Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to those of you who are tuning in from North America, and greetings to everyone in whatever time zone you may be in, and welcome to my Stage 1 Confirmation of Candidature presentation. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Bundjalung country and that this is stolen Aboriginal land, sovereignty was never ceded, and that exploitation and dispossession are still ongoing processes relevant to today. Okay, I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of personal background as a way of introducing the main concepts and relations of the study and to understand how I came to develop this project. So in the top left there, that's me on my first day of school. That's my kindergarten teacher in green, Mrs. LeBreton, and my mom standing proudly to the right. And as you move around the screen clockwise, you get all of the major milestones on my journey through the formal education system. You get my graduation from junior high school, from high school, and then my undergraduate university degree. And so as I was undergoing this journey through school and university, there were two distinct economics-based processes that were going on that are really central to my study. So I'll talk a bit about them. The first one is that my hometown of Mississauga and country of Canada, and indeed the entire global economy was and still is growing, which resulted in the forest near my house shrinking. So we moved into a brand new suburb when I was 4, which enveloped that forest as it grew. And I can remember, for example, sitting in a cubby house that the neighbors' kids had made from construction pallets. And it was right on the edge of this brand new subdivision. And from there, we could look out at this vast tract of new land that had been cleared for more houses and more roads and so on. And this process of economic growth is a distinct tendency of a capitalist economy. It tends to grow. The other process that was going on as I was going through school and university is that I was unwittingly being prepared for employment. And though it probably sounds pretty naive, to be honest, I didn't really give much thought to the world of work for which I was being prepared until my final year of university, where I studied physics and engineering. And generally, I've studied what I have in my life because I find it interesting, with little regard for its labor market potential. And so after graduation, I struggled to find the couple of casual jobs that I did, which were insufferably boring anyway. And so after about a year and a half, I left the engineering profession altogether without really a clear plan of what to do. Okay, the other little bit of personal background that I want to share, which is really crucial in leading me to choose social ecology for the theory of my project, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly, was 4 years living on an intentional and certified organic farming community called Jasper Hall in the hinterland of Byron Bay. So this was an enormously transformational period of my life, but I'm just going to focus on one important detail, which had to do with the political organization of the community. So we had what was called a consensus decision-making model, which meant that agreements would only go ahead if from all voting members of the community, of which I was one. And in fact, in the bottom right there, that's a picture from one of our meetings, and that's me in the middle. So in practice, this protected the land and the people living there from any rash or partisan decisions from any single person or faction. So, for example, you couldn't just, chop down a tree or expel someone from the community. You'd have to discuss it at a meeting and get everyone to agree with it. So in other words, democracy, which is what we were doing, is good for both society and the environment. And this is really central to social ecology, which I'll come back to. Okay, so I just mentioned the theory of my project. Now I'm in a bit of an unusual position at this early stage in the PhD journey, in the sense that I already have these 3 papers you can see on the screen here, published in peer-reviewed journals. And together they form an integrated theoretical framework for the project. So as we proceed, I'm going to summarize a little bit of these, but other parts I'm just going to assert with the understanding that you can read these yourselves if you want to get the full evidence and argument for what I'm saying. And if you do read them, I'd suggest you read them in the order in which I've put them on the screen here from top to bottom. I'll include all of these in the references at the end of my presentation, and they're all available on my website, jasonvantol.com. Okay, so let's get into the project proper. So my project is based on two related tensions, or you might want to call them conflicts, that reflect the personal background that I just gave. So the first one here is between economic growth and ecological sustainability. And the key to understanding this tension is to understand that the economy is a real thing. Sometimes people think of the economy as this abstract thing out there in the ether. And indeed, the financial economy is an abstract system of credit and debt relations, but it's joined to what economists call the real economy. And as the name suggests, the real economy requires real matter and energy for the production of real goods and services, which come from and return to the environment. So as the economy grows, it expands into the surrounding environment, or it expands into surrounding ecosystems, degrading their functionality as it does so. And this is just what happened to the forest near my house that I described just before, and has been going on since World War II deliberately worldwide. Now, before I go on, I want to introduce a key word, this one in red at the bottom of the screen, this word throughput. So this is actually a thermodynamics concept in origin, but it can be applied to any real system, whether that's an internal combustion engine or a human body, or in this case, an economy. And it refers to all of the matter and energy flowing through that system. Again, in this case, an economy. And because the planet and the solar energy irradiating it, and indeed resources generally are limited, it's clear that the economy cannot grow forever on a finite planet. So in practice, this conflict or tension between economic growth and ecological sustainability looks like this. And so this is a big problem with dire environmental consequences. What's the solution? Well, let's consider what the goal of ecological sustainability might mean. So an essential part of ecological sustainability requires a limit on throughput, directly in opposition to economic growth. And these color changes in material output from the economy that you can see on your screen here, represent qualitative changes in material output with, and this is key, with the throughput held steady. So quantitatively, all the matter and energy flowing through the economy is not growing, but qualitatively, these color changes could represent, for example, technological development, changes in fashion, culture, wealth distribution, and so on. So hence, I'm defining a key criterion of ecological sustainability to be the collective imposition of limits on throughput. Okay, so this makes sense. And indeed, in my view, this is the only system-wide biophysically coherent meaning of sustainability. But the question arises, though, how are we going to achieve these limits on throughput? Will these limits be provided by natural means, of which biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution buildup, and so on are expressions? Or will these limits be imposed intentionally by humans to keep the throughput within the bounds of what the planet can provide for our needs and assimilate our wastes far into the future? Well, I'm hoping for the second of these answers to this question, and there are many ways to go about this. But in this project, I'm focusing on the educational means to impose these limits. And this leads to the second tension in my thesis. So this educational tension is based on two very different purposes of school. The first one being for employment, which in this project I take a very critical view of. Now, employment is such a commonplace purpose of education nowadays, not just in Australia, but throughout the global north, that it seems odd that anyone would want to get rid of it. And as I mentioned, I certainly never gave it any thought while I was going through school. But in fact, from the early 19th century, the overarching goal of the labor movement and the working class struggle was to abolish employment, or more precisely, wage labor, which underpins it. Now, why is this? Well, basically, it had to do for reasons of power imbalance at work. And current definitions of employment reflect this. So, for example, according to the Australian government Fair Work Ombudsman, an employee is one who, quote, performs work under the direction and control of their employer on an ongoing basis. And the tension or conflict arises due to a second long-standing educational policy goal, which in Australia has been referred to as active and informed citizenship. So one of the characteristics of these active citizens is that they, quote, work for the common good, in particular sustaining and improving natural and social environments. So active and informed citizenship contributes to democracy, i.e. working freely for the common good with rather than for other people. And this can, as this characteristic suggests, help to sustain natural environments and improve social ones. This is just what I experienced while I was living on community at Jasper Hall. Now, I just want to pause for a moment here and just share that from experience, I found that while the first of these tensions I described, that between economic growth and ecological sustainability, seems fairly easy for most people to understand and get on board with, even becoming mainstream with people like Kate Raworth and Jason Hickel and others. This tension having to do with the purpose of school and specifically the criticism of employment seems to be harder for some people to accept and to agree with. Um, I don't know why exactly. It could be because some people are not familiar with labor history, and so this criticism appears to just drop out of the sky, or they just don't like it for ideological reasons. But in any case, I think if you just look at these two definitions, and by the way, of course, these are not my definitions, these are the Australian government's definitions. If you just look at them, you can see that these are two radically different conceptions of work, and that therefore, I'm arguing, education and preparation for one will tend to occur at the expense of the other. Okay, so I'm going to put this all together now. So I've developed a model of education based on the theory of social ecology, which I mentioned before, mostly emanating from the work of Murray Bookchin. So what's social ecology? Well, the core idea is that ecological problems stem from social problems, hence the name social ecology. And the idea is that if we want to fix our ecological problems, we need to fix our social problems, especially those having to do with power. So more specifically, this principle of social ecology states that humans' power over nature stems from humans' power over one another. Okay, so how have I interpreted this principle? Well, humans' power over nature is expressed through the first tension I described, that between economic growth and ecological sustainability. But according to this principle of social ecology, that problem stems from this other problem of humans' power over one another, which is expressed through education's tendency, especially in the neoliberal era of unemployment, to prepare young people for employment. I mean, why should education prepare young people to perform work under the direction and control of someone else? There's no natural law requiring this. Rather, this is the result of the historical development of capitalism. And look, there's a lot more to say about this and including some nuance that I'm not letting on. But anyway, that's the basic idea. Now, as for the very important link between these two expressions of power to show that one stems from the other, I'm not going to go into any great detail here, but both Keynesian and neoclassical economic theory support it. It's called Okun's law, if someone wants to read about it. But to get the basic idea, just think of the jobs and growth mantra. Excuse me. The idea is to use economic growth to provide for jobs, meaning employment. Okay, so this is a social ecological problem emanating from a capitalist economy, the two bits in the middle. And the solution, or part of the solution that I'm arguing for, is to pursue an alternative purpose of schooling, namely active citizenship education. Hence the second tension in the model. And now lastly, and though this idea is not yet very well developed in my publications or otherwise, but hopefully will become more so as I carry out the project. The idea is that active citizenship education can be aimed at imposing those collective limits on throughput that I mentioned before, which in turn will contribute to ecological sustainability. Okay, so there you go. That's the theory in a nutshell. Woo, finally, we're done the theory. So what is this research project actually about? Well, the aim of the project is to investigate how young people navigate the tensions, these two bits in red, between a capitalist economy, this thing in the middle, education, the thing on the left, and ecological sustainability, the thing on the right. And in what ways that may contribute to active and informed citizenship. Okay, so that's the aim of the project. Now, as for my research questions, basically what I want to know is how do young people understand and respond to those two tensions, those two bits in red in the diagram? Now, why is this important? Well, recall Australia's long-standing educational policy goal that all young Australians become active and informed citizens who work for the common good, in particular sustaining and improving natural and social environments. I think this is a great purpose of school, right? I could get behind this any day of the week. But the question is, how well is it being achieved, especially in relation to this alternative purpose of school, of education for employment? And you may like to reflect on your own experience at school to see which of these two prevailed for you. For me, I think it's pretty clear that there's substantial room for improvement in achieving this goal. And so if we're going to take it seriously, as I think we should, then for the purposes of research-led teaching that contributes to its achievement, we need to know what young people understand about their obstacles to it, namely those two tensions. Now, why is that? Well, as a basic principle of the learning sciences, people learn based on their prior knowledge and understanding or misunderstanding. People are not just empty vessels into which, following what Paulo Freire called the banking model of education, into which we can just, deposit knowledge. It doesn't work like that. People have their own prior conceptions and misconceptions, understandings and misunderstandings, and we need to know what those are to overcome these and design appropriate teaching resources to help overcome these and help young people move toward this educational goal. Okay, so what have other people written about my topic and my questions? What does it say in the literature? Here I'm just going to let the literature speak for itself. So, quote, empirical research on undergraduate students' perception of and attitude to economic growth is virtually non-existent. And the other most relevant study, the quote, we do not know how, in this case it was high school students, we do not know how high school students understand the concepts of economic growth, economic development, and sustainable development. Thus, research based on qualitative approaches that investigates these aspects would be of great significance. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the literature on my first question. Now, as for the second question and the second tension that I described, here the gap in the literature is also quite vacuous, but also quite different too, and I think more intriguing, and moreover, from a theoretical standpoint, more important. So remember, the idea of social ecology is that ecological problems stem from or are the result of social, or in this case, educational problems. So what does the literature say about that? There are many large-scale studies involving tens of thousands of young people on citizenship education, in which they express views critical of what they perceive, probably correctly, of asymmetric power relations in schools that result in hierarchy by authority, with them, of course, at the bottom of the pyramid. And, you can read about them expressing views that, they want to have more input into their learning environments and control, or some participation in decision making that affects their schooling, things like this. And yet, when it comes to the literature on young people's views in which they're critical of employment and education in preparation for it, these are exceedingly rare. Um, the one exceptional study is this one here by Ronald Sultana, published almost 35 years ago. Okay, and lastly, I've included this last little bit here just as a bit of a segue. This study in the literature review, Schwartz et al. Again advised qualitative studies, but here they were even more specific. They suggested using in-depth interviews or focus groups. So I'll transition to the methodology now, starting with the ontology. So ontology is a study of what exists, and of course, all sorts of things exist. But in this study, I'm really focused on the relations between things, or in other words, I'm taking what's called a relational ontology. And the core idea of a relational ontology is that the relations between things are more important than the things themselves. So there are all sorts of relationships in the world. What kinds of relations exist? How should we characterize them? Well, for the purpose of this study, I'm contrasting two, hierarchical and what's called in the literature flat. And hopefully you can see from what I've said before that hierarchical relations inhere in the employer-employee relationship, and that more flat or equal relations exist in a democracy and are fostered by active citizenship. Again, much like my experience at Jasper Hall. Okay, as for the epistemology, so epistemology is about how we know about what exists. And so in this project, I'm taking what's called a critical epistemological position. And the focus of it is on understanding structures of domination and power with the goal of being freed from those structures and moving toward this democratic ideal of more equal power relations in decision-making processes. Again, much like my experience at Jasper Hall. Okay, now for the methodology, look, I had a bit of trouble in fitting a methodology to the ontology and epistemology that I just described, as well as the methods of data collection recommended in the literature. So action research appears to be the closest appropriate off-the-shelf methodology. I'm pretty familiar with action research. I used it for my honors thesis on student activism, but even this, I don't think will really be appropriate for what I'm doing, because I don't think I'm going to have time to complete one full action research cycle, which is really a core feature of action research. And so I wanted to avoid the trap of having to choose a pre-configured methodology. And so I thought I would just give a name to one myself, which I called critical pragmatism. Now, I don't think critical pragmatism is actually a methodology where researchers are supposed to follow some well-described sequence of steps, but the pragmatic approach to research allows one the freedom to make decisions appropriate to the project at hand. So in my case, attending to the theoretical development that I talked about, as well as the ontology and epistemology, and of course, also the methods of data collection that were informed by the literature. Now, as for the research setting, so this is going to take place in Australia, but online. And this opens up the possibility that I could be engaging young people anywhere in the world. I'm not planning on this happening, but it's conceivable that it could happen. And this opens up certain ethical considerations, which I will go into detail after this presentation. But at very base, I'm going to need to get informed consent from the participants who will be aged 18 through 24 inclusive. Okay, so in terms of the data collection and analysis, so what am I actually going to do to answer these research questions, and how am I going to do it? Well, the idea is to recruit about 30 young people, again, aged between 18 and 24 inclusive, and again, predominantly from Australia, and to conduct and record semi-structured interviews with them, and then to perform a thematic analysis on those recordings, and then to use those themes I've extracted from the analysis to help answer the research questions. And because I presume there is a life after a PhD, I've listed these last two dot points here as postdoctoral work. So then, of course, to use the answers to my research questions to inform the creation of teaching resources, and then, of course, to use those teaching resources to, to further the aim of the project. Okay, in terms of the research timeline and budget, so here we are in this yellow row here, completing the stage 1 assessment. This is a part-time timeline, by the way. I'm doing the PhD by part-time. So, you know, it's possible that if I blaze through everything that I've written here or planned for here, yeah, it's possible I could get started on some of that postdoctoral work as part of the PhD, but I don't want to have to rush in order to do it, nor is it necessary. So I'm going to be submitting my PhD by portfolio, which of course will include those three papers that I showed before on the theory. And I expect that from my results, I will be able to publish at least one more paper, and perhaps as many as 4 or more, which will be plenty enough for the purposes of a PhD. And lastly, about the budget. So I'm expecting this project to be very cheap. The bean counters will be happy to know. Maybe just $50 associated with flyering for recruitment. But what is expensive, or I should say valuable, is my time and labor in carrying out this project. But that's okay. I'm happy to use my time and labor to carry out this project because I think it's really important. And I hope you think it's really important too. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. Here are my references. And now I think we have some time for questions. Thank you.